Thanks to the organizers. I'm really happy to share this ongoing research with you. This paper has to do with nature in us. Plato's Phaedo is famous, but its narrator has gone almost unnoticed. Phaedo of Elis was reduced to a beautiful young man broken by grief, whose hair Socrates strokes in 89 BC. He's a colorful but secondary character in this iconic picture. However, a more careful examination brings a second reading to the surface, largely changing this original image. In this presentation, I will review the role of physiognomy in the discussion about human nature in the classical period. Then I will explore Phaedo's profile and his theories on human nature and the soul as outlined in the Zopyrus. Finally, I will examine some hints of Plato's Phaedo to explain why Plato may have chosen him as the central character. The problem of nature becomes controversial when it comes to human nature. Many studies focus on Homer because psyche and soma do not correspond to body and soul. However, against what is often assumed, such a model persists well beyond the archaic period, at least partially. For instance, the magical practices of the 5th and 4th centuries before Christ still used conception incompatible with dualistic schemes. This is also true of the Socratic philosophies, which encompass purely corporealist models, for instance, those of Aristippus and Antisthenes. This means that Plato's scheme was not unique or mainstream. A second interesting point relates on physiognomy. The practice that interprets, we can say, bodily signs. It has Eastern origins, but it's not absent from Greece, albeit it has different features. The Western version does not involve divination and therefore does not overlap with that realm. Beyond some Homeric instances, Pythagoras is a relevant antecedent. After learning it from the Near East, he selected his disciples through physiognomy. These testimonies are late and doubtful, but stress the proto-technical dimension of physiognomy. Within philosophy, the case of Plato is far the most studied. Still, Antisthenes wrote a physiognomic, or on the physiognomy sophists, focusing on the professional profile related to physiognomy services. Therefore, physiognomy was among the ways of knowing nature during the classical period that sought to be recognized as the technique. It is also the case of rhetoric, as shown in Gorgias. It happens in medicine, which is clear in many Hippocratic texts. The technical dimension is a quest of mathematicians also, who enhance their explanatory systems to improve consistency, and this trend is present even in history. Still, not all practices that sought to become techniques succeeded. This is the case of divination, often called mantike techne in ancient texts, that knew moments of high prestige before falling straight into the pit of pseudoscience. This missystem and mere quackery, as is often done, misses the opportunity to study processes of incomplete transformation into techne, and assumes an idea of rigorous science at odds with the parameters of many accepted fields. In the case of physiognomy, it attempted to become a techne based on its peculiar way of accounting for nature. This approach faced some disadvantages, such as overlapping with other disciplines. Medicine incorporated some of these central elements as its own. For instance, humoral theory was associated with inference about physical traits, and alternative views combined aspects of climate and physiognomic analysis of characters to identify diverse kinds of disease. The most solid attempt at technical conversion appears in the physiognomic treatise contained in the Aristotelian corpus, which deal with physical affection resulting semeia from the disposition of the soul. However, we are interested in a previous step in this development. This brings us the case of Phaedo of Elis, who led the Socratic group. Among his works was the Zopyrus, whose name refers to a Persian physiognomist. This figure came to Athens claiming to be able to determine an individual character by his body. When brought before Socrates, the expert ruled that he was vicious. The audience, which consisted of Socrates' close associates and thus witnesses of his virtuous life, began to mock him. However, instead of supporting the disqualification of physiognomic analysis, Socrates seconded it by affirming that he indeed possessed such vices, but he mastered them. Because of this reaction, some interpreters suppose that Phaedo accepted physiognomy. Still, in fact, it seems to be the opposite. The Zopyrus criticizes physiognomy and proposed a model focused on bodily tendencies to stress that will and reason can oppose them. I will analyze some relevant passages, but only after considering the curious description of Socrates' appearance and their role. Oddities between body and character are not strange even in Homer. This inconsistency affects other people within the Socratic circle, such as Alcibiades, beautiful but misguided, or Theodorus, lucid but ugly. It is generally assumed that this was also Socrates' case, whose ugliness contrasted with his mental traits against the parameter of Kalokagatia. However, Aristophanes describes him differently. Against the idea of just and adverse source, Plutarch exalts his reliability because he says, having said that Socrates was uneducated, ignorant, and without self-control, he added, but there was no injustice involved. The first two statements could be a reference to his late education and his training in a manual craft, but the last remark is striking. He has no self-control, to the point of being unimpeachable. Interestingly, Socrates is, in this picture, an example of acrasia. How is this trait to be interpreted? Aristophanes relies on the direct testimony of his father and offers a broader outline. It says, this man said that he at least has not encountered many more persuasive men, such as his voice, his speech, and the character manifest in them. And in addition to all those things, his singular appearance. This occurred when he was not angry. But when this emotion inflamed him, his lack of decorum and disfigurement was terrible, for he did not refrain from any word or action. This testimony emphasizes his singular appearance, heteroidus idiotes. He was strange, not beautiful, but neither was he simply ugly. On the other hand, he has a persuasive voice and pitch which suggests harmony or subjugating qualities. This is consistent with the profile that the Socraticoi logoi tried to strengthen. However, this temper was broken by fits of rage, of orge, that provoke a deineas hemosine, that is a terrible disfigurement, a body transformation accompanied by unbridled words and deeds. Dr. Jekyll often became Mr. Hyde, you can say. This is precisely the problem of Phaedo's Zopyrus. In line with the format of the Socratic dialogue, Socrates refuted his interlocutor, in this case the Persian physiognomist. Rossetti considers this dialogue as a confidence from Socrates about his inner self, which could be the main value of the prosaic passages. Still, two related elements must be added. On the one hand, Zopyrus represents physiognomy's technical claim that Phaedo denied ruling out any kind of bodily determinism. On the other hand, the anecdote countered Socrates' reputation for lack of control. This is not abundant in the Socratic dialogues, which prefer to disdain this outburst, but it does not imply their inexistence. On the contrary, Phaedo may have faced this issue to define it as a tendency that Socrates was able to master. In Memorabilia, Xenophon accounts for Socrates' controversial ideas about violence against parents, for instance, and admits that some of his judgments could be interpreted as a justification for this kind of behavior and provides an alternative explanation. In the same way, the Zopyrus takes up the doubts about his continence and describes it as the result of a struggle against physical tendencies that needs to be controlled. If so, the information about Socrates' inner self, acknowledged by Rossetti, was a way to define Socrates against the accusation of flawed character. Therefore, the Zopyrus was a justification of the superiority of philosophy over physiognomy as its technical pretension and a defense of Socrates. Let us now analyze the testimonies about Zopyrus, seeking to infer Phaedo's view of human nature. The first thing to note is that Zopyrus' profile is consistent with Greek physiognomy and not with the version that Diogenes Laertius attributes to Aristotle about a magician from Syria who would have foretold Socrates a violent death. This alignment with technical physiognomy, we could say, is in keeping with a critique of this practice that goes hand in hand with an alternative explanation of the origin of actions and character. There are three basic versions of the anecdote of the encounter with Zopyrus, two by Cicero and one by Alexander of Aphrodisias. In the former, nature appears as a fixed horizon not subject to change, which can at most be restrained. The means of restraining natural tendencies differ in both Cicero's version. One appeals to the will and the other to reason. In Tusculan Disputation, Socrates seconded Zopyrus by saying that vices were present in him, but he kept them at bay by reason, which becomes the driving force. It is an exaggeration to suppose that the formulation necessarily coincides with the Socratic intellectualism found in Plato, according to which once the good is understood, acquiescence is automatic, but it operates with similar elements. However, in the Phaedo, Cicero points to the education of emotions to achieve moderation and avoid temptations. He says, these vices could be born of natural causes, but to extirpate them and remove them completely, so that someone prone to so many vices could restrain them, is not possible by natural causes, but with will, dedication, and discipline. This is a scheme of continence and not of unconflicted choice of the good. Then Alexander's version is different. It presents a changeable nature that can be modified to correct negative tendencies or worsen them through bad influences. He says, Socrates did not say at all that Zopyrus had lied, for it would have been so as far his nature was concerned, if through exercise in philosophy he had not improved his nature. In addition to these variants concerning physiognomy, there are two additional pieces of information whose function in the work is impossible to determine. However, both are closely related to the subject of the soul and its possibilities to make changes against natural or previous tendencies. A grammatical commentary by Theon offers as an example of a quotation from the Zopyrus and mentions an anecdote. This anecdote says that a Persian prince raised a lion cub that obeyed him. The text says, it seems to me that the lion, having grown up with him, followed the boy wherever he went, so that the Persian said that he loved the boy. Without the context, the meaning of the story is hard to determine. Maybe it showed that the change of natural tendencies even in animals. The lion, despite its wild nature, could form a bond with human beings in certain circumstances. This situation also can apply to human beings. If so, creating conditions for reorienting natural tendencies through education is critical. It is noteworthy that Alcibiades, sometimes called the lion cub, is in the background. Perhaps the play included some kind of allusion to this resemblance, especially considering that Zopyrus was also the name of Alcibiades' tutor. But this is only speculation. The relevant point is that Phaedo's cathartic notion of philosophy focused on this power to produce changes even in men of bad nature. This optimism implies that he considered that virtue could be taught, which is explicit in the testimony about the teachers that produce changes in people even without them realizing it, like insect bites that are not noticed at the time. This strong confidence in transmission is far from the doubts of other Socratics. At the same time, the simile of the sting does not make it clear whether the nature of the soul is changed or only acted upon despite it. The latter is more plausible, so that every human being has a nature that governs irrational desires and can be reconstructed by physiognomic study. However, nature does not determine behavior, which, on the contrary, can be reoriented through education. In line with interactionist views, soul and body are different, but they affect each other. The burden of somatic tendencies is underlined, but also the independence of mental aspects. If so, physiognomy accounts for this scheme only partially, and for this reason does not disturb the status of technique. We need philosophy to overcome these shortcomings, which is the central tenet of Phaedo's approach. Why Plato might have chosen Phaedo of Elis to recount Socrates' last philosophical talk about human nature? Let us look at his biography. Several sources refer to a lurid story. A young nobleman of Elis turns first into a prisoner of war and then a victim of human trafficking, enslaved in a brothel for Ephesus. Then he was freed through Socrates' intervention. This event justified his preeminent place in the dialogue that distinguishes soul and body, insisting on the body's and the senses enslaving character. Someone who has suffered literal slavery in his body gives the story much greater force. Phaedo can testify that we are all prisoners of the somatic tyranny. But did Phaedo's role end there? Maybe not. Plato often had in mind the contribution of the figures he included in the dialogues. In this case, Phaedo's interest in psychology is far from an accident and could explain the contrast between this dialogue and other works such as Republic and Timaeus. Short boystones suggest that Plato's Phaedo can be used as a source for Phaedo's of Elis ideas, which seems a bit exaggerated, but perhaps offers some hints of his thought. His dualistic anthropology was consistent with the dialogue on the soul and immortality. It makes no sense to attribute the theory of forms to Phaedo's philosophy. No testimony attributes anything of the kind to him. Still, Phaedo's Zopyrus presented philosophy as a way of self-care to strengthen the soul dimension, and the same can be said of Plato's Phaedo. If so, their association could be positive to enhance this shared non-corporealist anthropology within and beyond the Socratic group. The sources do not show a close bond between them, and Athenaeus illustrates Plato's bad attitude towards his companions by mentioning an attack against Phaedo. However, this is not an obstacle. The whole phenomenon of Socratic dialogue is based on a curious shared attitude in people who deeply dislike each other. In this case, the association to support anti-corporealism was justified. Plato stressed the soul's capacity to oppose the body, and Phaedo agreed. It did not matter so much if Phaedo's view was less complex or did not thematize parts and functions. The critical point was to portray Socrates chatting with as many members of the Socratic group as possible in favor of the immaterial soul. Phaedo, Simmias, and Cebes were the roots of this strategy. Indeed, Simmias and Cebes wrote dialogues, and although we do not preserve them, their association with Philolaus and the Pythagoreans make them agreement plausible. At the same time, Xenophon stated in Memorabilia that they often visited the Heterotheodota, hence they depended on the body and sex and happens in Phaedo's story. That is, they share a similar profile within the group. If so, Plato was not alone. He did not try to put crazy ideas into Socrates' mouth. On the contrary, in his absence, while he was sick, Socrates and other members shared this kind of ideas. Some of them, such as Criton, did not. Towards the end, he was obsessed with the corpse and Socrates reprimanded him for not understanding. But the interlocutors and the narrator too. And Plato rests on this basis to build his augmented version of Socrates and the theory of the forms. On the other hand, Plato focuses on Phaedo to present several remarks about the link between body and mind, thus reflecting Phaedo's interest. For instance, in 58e, he describes his experience and Socrates' body. With a phenomenological perspective, we could say he does not give in compassion and sadness at the approaching death of his friend. He observes and notes him as happy and serene. He insists on reaction of rejoicing, for example, in 62e or 75e. As in Phaedo's Zopyrus, Socrates is atypical and confuses those present, mixing laughter and weeping. Let us mention briefly three examples. First, the confusion derived from the removal of the shackles in 60 BC, when the physical pleasure contrasts with the general mood. And in 83a, the body as a prison and the risk of corporealization of the soul lead to the passage of the ghost to thematize the soul's action on the body. Then in 115b, before drinking the hemlock, Socrates sketches self-care as the main subject of the preceding conversation and his primary interest, which defines the dualistic scheme as the basis of Socratic philosophy. He rebukes Criton for worrying about the funeral by saying, "Once I have drunk the poison, I will no longer stay with you. And shortly afterward, you bury my body." I will not dwell here on the debated interpretation of the final words. Crito, we owe Asclepius a cock, so pay it to him and don't be careless. The idea that Asclepius cures Socrates of life is as widespread as Vilamovit's criticism. Neither life is a disease, nor Asclepius cures evils of the soul. Both options are as unlikely as other speculation. However, it is worth remembering that the cock was associated with transition, especially birth, because of its association with the beginning of the day. Therefore, it feels in well with Asclepius, who was the transition to Hades, Persephone, and the underworld. The hypothesis that the mention of the cock for Asclepius refers to some private motive, and Plato incorporates it only to emphasize to the last moment that the man condemned for not believing in the gods dedicate his last words to a god is possible. But these words also point to Phaedo. Yes. The best-known passage in which he appeared is undoubtedly 89b, where Socrates grabs his hair and discourages him from cutting it off as a sign of mourning. "Today I will cut mine and you yours if reasoning dies on us and we cannot revitalize it." Possibly at the moment of death, Socrates remembers that the argument about immortality has been killed and therefore he can go away at ease, confident that only his body will die. Asclepius is to be thanked because the Socratic discussion was saved as a result of the shared task, after reference to Heracles and Philolaus' remarks. In sum, if Phaedo's Zopyrus has a dualistic theory of the soul, Plato's Phaedo may be a way of using it to explore human anthropology from a non-corporealist view, which fits well with the studies on immortality. This sheer effort could explain the difference with the Republic, because the main task of the Phaedo is to stress the Socratic views that focus on the soul. In this sense, Phaedo is an ally in rejecting the corporalist variants within the Socratic circle, earning him the role of spokesman of the dialogue. He was there to defend a way to fade the relationship between nature and the human being. Thank you.